All right, hello and welcome everybody. This is the last episode of coverage of Murray Rothbard's America's Great Depression, and surprisingly, it's going to be a rather important one because I, in going through the appendix, I was expecting it to be kind of like a nothing episode, where I was just going to take some notes, kind of explain the mathematical connections from table to table. But in fact, I found out that Table 6 in the 5th edition, this one, with this cover, where does it say 5th edition? It says 5th edition somewhere. Here, yeah. So this is the 5th edition. And what I discovered is that Table 6 in the appendix of the 5th edition is mistaken. It is entirely wrong. It is, in fact, there's like some kind of a transcription error, and the contents of Table 6 in the appendix are identical to that of Chapter 7, but fortunately, using the earlier data from earlier tables, we can reconstruct Table 6 and show that it matches with what it would need to be for Table 8 to also work. So that's a big deal. I did not expect to find that, significant error in the book. When I get to it, I'll put it up on the screen. If you go to the website, I'll have my show notes with the correct thing in there. So this is worth noting, that if you're reading the 5th edition, and I don't have any earlier editions, so I can't tell you when the mistake happened. Table 6 is incorrect. But anyway, let's get into the appendix, and when we get to Table 6, we'll handle it there. So this is really short. The appendix is basically about that private product, the gross private product, or the net private product that Rothbard talked about in Chapter 9. So the point he is at pains to make here is that spending is really only proportional to how a person values a product when there's a voluntary trade, right? If I hand you an orange and you hand me an apple and we agree to that exchange, it's not that they have the same, value. It's that I value the orange and you value the apple, or I value the one I'm getting more than the one I'm giving up, right? This is kind of one of the basis statements about modern value theory that, confounded people up until Menger showed up, basically. Now, when a transaction is not voluntary, when a transaction is coercive, the government says, "Oh, I like that ton of steel that you have. Here's a nice shiny dollar." Well, you can't say no. You just kind of have to take the dollar. And so there's no way to determine whether value was gained or whether value was increased, or even that the value of the transactions were, corresponded in some way in reality. When transactions are coercive, the government spending doesn't need to provide any actual value if it doesn't want to. They can just eminent domain your stuff away, and you'd be lucky if you get pennies. A good example for this would be like, say that the government buys $1 million or $10 million worth of steel. Now that might be a pretty significant fraction of the American steel market, for all I know. Let's assume that it is a significant fraction. They could, if they wanted to, take that steel, put it on a boat, send it to the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and sink it to the bottom of the ocean. Now that's an extreme example. That's an example of government deliberately and exclusively destroying value. But the point is that any coercive behaviors by government mean that some value is almost certainly being lost, because the people would not have made that transaction if they had a choice. Basically, the way Rothbard puts it is that government spending deprives the citizen of real preferred goods or services. Or I think that's how Rothbard puts it. I wrote that down here, and I didn't mark it in red, so it must be related to something Rothbard wrote. So, in order to get away from the fact that gross national product takes government spending as just, yep, it's good, it's all good, it's just the same as any kind of private spending, the government just spends money and everybody's happy. Trying to get away from that is what Rothbard's doing with his private product construct. And the way that you calculate the private product, you can have the gross national product, or you can have the net national product. When you go from gross to net, what you do is you remove depreciation of capital and other capital consumption allowances. So, in order to get the private product, what you do is you take the GNP, or if you want the net private product, you take the net national product, and you subtract away the income originating in government, and then you get something called the gross private product, the net private product, GPP or NPP. That's N as in Archer joke. That's N as in Nancy. Now, what is depredation? Well, depredation, I need to. Okay, so hold on, I'm getting ahead of myself because this is written in kind of a strange order in the book. So we actually need to go a little further ahead first. Once you have the private product, whether it's gross or net, if you want to calculate the private product remaining in private hands, which is another construct of Rothbard's, what you do is you take that private product and you subtract the depredation. Now, depredation is a term that Rothbard is using here. What it is the larger of government receipts or government expenditures. So if the government spends more and has a deficit, then you take the spending. If the government spends less and has a surplus, then you take the taxation. That is to say, receipts. And the argument Rothbard makes for this is that if spending is greater than receipts, then the deficit is being financed by new money or by borrowing private savings. And both of those things take goods out of private hands. Similarly, if spending is less than receipts, then that surplus is being created by draining the private sector via taxes. Now, it's worth noting that this is a reason for anyone following Rothbard's train of thought to be really, really, really extra against government deficit spending. Because for deficit spending to happen, right, first there's that extra depredation of the pulling in private savings or creating new money. And then there's also the depredation from having to tax that money back out to repay those debts. So this makes government debt especially bad for a Rothbardian. One point that Rothbard makes is that there's these things called government enterprises. Basically, these are government bodies that charge fees. They're the government playing at markets, right? And often these things are lumped into private statistics. And so it can be very hard to separate real private products from fake private products that are produced by government enterprises, where you're kind of forced to pick up this fee because, auto licenses would probably be a good example of that. There would be some kind of auto licensing system in a laissez-faire system, but the fact that the government has these licenses doesn't mean that those licenses are in any sort of concord with a realistic valuation of what those licenses would be worth on a free market. They're just arbitrary things that are chosen, and you might be overpaying or underpaying, and if you're underpaying, then someone else is paying somewhere else via taxation, inflation, borrowing, etc. Now, with that said, Rothbard starts going into tables, and there's quite a few of them. I think there's like there's 8 tables in this chapter, but one of them has 4 parts, so we're going to be slogging through this. It's worth noting that Rothbard says that if you want information about government enterprise expenditures and stuff, that he recommends this study by Solomon Fabricant and Robert E. Lipsey called The Trend of Government Activity in the United States Since 1900. I'll have the links for that in the description. It's actually freely available. So, now we get to our favorite part of any Austrian text in economics, the math. Don't worry, it's all really simple. Table 1. These are just straight up statistics. There's no math involved. Rothbard tabulates the national product, the gross and net national products for the years of 1929 through 1932. And he's using calendar years. And there's a little bit of iffiness here because some of the data that he has is based on fiscal years, not calendar years. And so there's a question of of how much of it actually kind of like works out that way. But the math here is so simple that what gets added somewhere else is going to get subtracted somewhere else. So it's not really that big of a worry. But that's table 1. It's just 3 columns. Column 1 is year, and column 2, technically it's 2 columns because the year column isn't really a column of data. It's just, here's the years. But you have gross and net national product. Next up, we have table 2, which is income originating in government. And of course, this book is freely available. We've got links to get you that free copy of the 5th edition PDF from the Mises Institute. So if you want to look at these tables, please go do that. But Table 2 is income originating in government, and it's split into 5 columns. Again, we're just covering the years from 1929 through 1932, so there's 4 rows. The first column of data is federal government. The second column is federal government enterprises. Third is state and local governments. Fourth is state and local government enterprises. And then the fifth is just the sum of all the other 4. For Table 2, he's not differentiating between federal and state and local for the purposes of that total. But that is something that he will do later, so we need to watch out for that. Moving on to Table 3, we have the private product. In Table 3, again, we have the 4 years as our rows, and again, we have 5 columns. Column 1 and 2 are taken straight from Table 1. They're the gross national product and gross private product. Column number 3 is total income originating in government and government enterprises, which is taken from the last column of Table 2. And then by subtracting column 3 from column 1, we get column 4. And subtracting column 3 from column 2, we get column 5. So, as I mentioned earlier, we're taking the the gross private product, or we're taking the gross national product, subtracting away the total income originating in government and government enterprises, and that gives us the gross private product. Same thing with net, only we replace the word gross with net. That's Table 3. Again, basic math here. A lot of our data is coming from earlier tables, so this has been pretty simple so far. Next up, we have Table 4, Government Expenditures. Again, 4 years, 4 rows, 3 columns this time. We have federal expenditures, state and local, and then we have the total, which is just the sum of the other 2. So for instance, in 1929, we had $2.9 billion in federal expenditures, we had $8.2 in state and local, and the total of those is $11.1. Not too bad so far either, but we're getting to the real clinch point here. Because next up is Table 5, and that is the expenditures of government enterprises. Now, here we have 5 columns again, 4 rows for the 4 different years. We have, in the first column, income originating from the federal government. And that is identical to column 2 of Table 2. We have, in the second column, purchases from business by the federal government. Now, that I don't think we have anywhere else. Those values are $500 million per year, all 4 years. Fine, fair enough. Third column is income originating from state and local governments. That is going to be the same as government enterprises. That's going to be the same as column 4 of Table 2, right? And then column 4 is purchases from businesses by state and local governments. Again, that's fresh data. We haven't seen that before. And then the 5th column is just the total expenditures, which is the sum of the previous 4 columns. So far, so good. Now here's where things get strange. If you look at Table 6 is called Expenditures of Government and Government Enterprises. And the numbers on there are very strange because what those numbers should be is they should be the sums of the appropriate columns from Tables 4 and 5, right? If we take the federal expenditures, column 1 from Table 4, and we take columns 1 and 2 from Table 5, then those should sum up to what we end up at for column 1 of Table 6. But they don't. And in fact, we see that they don't. If we move on to the next page, what we observe is that Table 7 has this is called Receipts of Government and Government Enterprises. And that one's interesting because it is exactly the same as Table 6 in my edition. I'll just kind of see if I can show that a little bit. There's Table 6. And here's Table 7. They are identical in this edition. Now that's not correct. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to put up on the screen the Table 6 that we derive from summing Tables 4 and 5 appropriately. So I'm just going to have that there. Should be on the screen right now. Again, it'll be available on the website. But, it's really not too complicated. We take the federal things and we mix them together to get the federal thing. And then we take the state and local things from those two charts, and we put them all together to get the state and local things. Now, it's worth noting that we can actually check our work and make sure that this is correct, because, as we all know, or as Rothbard has stated, the depredation is the larger of either government income or government expenditures, right? So here's the cool part. If we look at Table 8, the top part of Table 8, I'm going to call it Table 8.1, we have federal depredation and state and local depredation in columns 3 and 4, right? Now, the federal depredation numbers, the first two of them match Table 7, right? But the bottom two for 1931 and 1932 do not. In Table 7, it's 5.2 billion and 4.4 billion for 1929 and 1930, respectively. And we see those numbers in the federal depredation number here. And then in 1931 and 1932, we have 3.4 and 3.0 as the receipts of government and government enterprises in those years. And in Table 8.1, we see 5.5 and 4.4. Those don't match. But if you go back to the Table 6 that I derived from Tables 4 and 5, you'll see that 5.5 and 4.4 are government expenditures in 1931 and 1932, federal specifically. And then we also notice that none of the state and local depredation in column 4 of Table 8.1 match Table 7. But we do see that they do match our reconstructed Table 6. So with that, I think I'm fairly certain that we've recalculated and reconstructed Table 6 correctly. So again, it was on the screen a few seconds ago, and it'll be over on the website in the show notes. Actually, I think it's on the website and in the show notes, because this is a big deal. When you have actual data that's tabulated in a physical book and you mess it up, that can be a big hit on the book's relevance going forward. And so the best way to maintain the relevance is to show that this is a minor mistake that can easily be fixed, even by someone as dumb as me, and we can create the correct table to replace Table 6 with the correct numbers, and that it matches later calculations that it must. So, there we go. We now have reconstructed Table 6. We now have confirmed that Table 7 is probably correct. Then we have Table 8.1. Table 8.1, we pull those GPP and NPP numbers from the earlier table. That'd be Table 3 for the first two columns. Then we have our two depredation columns. We've already dealt with those. Those are going to be the greater of the appropriate thing from either Table 6 reconstructed or Table 7. Most of them are from Table 6. And then we have a fifth column, which is total government depredations, which is the sum of the two previous columns, columns 3 and 4. So column 3 plus column 4 equals column 5. Okay. Now, Table 8.2, just below it. These are, in dollar terms, private product remaining and private product, or gross and net, basically. And so what we do to get those is we take the gross private product from Table 8.1 and we subtract the total government depredations from it. So 99.3 in 1929 with 14.2 billion in depredations drops to 85.1, and so on. The same is true of the net private product remaining in private hands, which takes column 2 of Table 8.1 and subtracts column 5 from that. So that's Table 8.2. Pretty simple. Again, just some subtraction. And then finally, we have Tables 8.3 and 8.4. Now, these are percentage versions, where basically what you do is you take the gross private product or net private product. Table 8.3 is about the gross private product. Table 8.4 is about the net private product. Aside from that, they have identical derivations. So for Table 8, Column 1, we have as our title for this data set, federal depredations as a percentage of GPP. So what we do is we take federal depredations, Column 5 of Table 8.1, and we divide it by the gross private product, 14.2 million, or billion, divided by 99.3 billion, and we get about 5.2%. There's a couple of rounding errors in this, so be careful. I think I saw one of them where it was 5.27, and he marks it as 5.2 or something like that. But within rounding errors, they seem to be correct. It's worth noting that okay, so I made a slight mistake here, because Table 8.3 separates things into federal depredations, state and local, and total. So what we actually need to do is take the 5.2 from federal depredation and divide that by 99.3 to get column 1. We take the 9.0 from state and local depredations, we divide it by 99.3 to get the 9.1% for state and local depredations of GPP. And then we take the 14.2 and divide that by 99.3 to get the 14.3% for that. Similarly, Table 8.4, we take the net private product from Table 8.1, and we do the same thing with it. We either take the federal depredation and divide it by net, or we take the state and local and divide it by net, or we take the total and divide it by net. And it's also worth noting that Table 8.4 has another error in that it's called MPP instead of NPP. It doesn't make any sense because MPP isn't something that Rothbard talks about at all. And the numbers make sense if you throw the NPP numbers in there. You get the right percentages. So, what do we learn from Table 8? What we learned from Table 8 is that depredations, government depredations, stayed kind of sort of constant, steady over these 4 years. However, what happened was that the private product dropped drastically. The gross private product in 1929 was $99.3 billion that year. In 1932, it was 53.3. So that's something like a 40% drop in gross private product. And if we take that same depredation and we pull those resources out of private hands in that year, it hurts a lot more. So when we look at depredations as a percentage of GPP, we see it kind of sort of steady at about 14, 15% in 1929 and 1930. And then it jumps up to 21.5 and 24.8% in 31 and 32. The same is it's similarly true of net private product as well. Net private product fell about as much as gross private product did, and therefore the depredations as a percentage of net private product rose in 31 and 32 as the government flailed about trying to, get things done via public works. So, hopefully that covers all of the math that we need. We've reconstructed Table 6. We've explained all the math for Table 8. In the show notes, I'm going to have stuff like this, where I say Table 8.2 column 1 is equal to Table 8.1 column 1 minus Table 8.1 column 2. And so all of that will be there so that you could work it into a spreadsheet if you wanted to and recheck all these numbers. But the bottom line of the appendix is that, number 1, private product is important. If the government just takes everything and blows it up in the middle of the ocean, they could do that. GDP would skyrocket, but it would hurt everybody because all of those products would be gone and wouldn't be able to be used for actually making people's lives better, right? Therefore, we need something other than GDP, other than net national product, NNP, right? That doesn't treat government spending as if it's the same as voluntary spending, because it isn't. One point that Rothbard makes is that, quote, any person who believes that there is more than 50% waste in government will have to grant that our assumption is more realistic than the standard one. So, do you think that there's 50% waste in government or more? I do. And so therefore, Rothbard's numbers are probably more useful for understanding how people's situations improved or deteriorated than simply looking at gross national product and net national product, where government spending is treated as just the same as private spending, private interactions. And, we shouldn't treat them as the same. It doesn't make any sense for resources that you voluntarily traded for to be treated the same as resources that were taken by pointing a gun at somebody's head. That's the libertarian argument about it. So, with this, we have completed our push through Murray Rothbard's America's Great Depression. As we've seen, it's a very dense book. It's got a lot of theory in the early parts and then a lot of history in the later parts. And the point that Rothbard is at pains to make is that all of this government spending by Hoover, number 1, destroys the myth that Hoover was laissez-faire, and number 2, shows that government spending to alleviate depressions often does worse. Because remember, at the end of this book, we're in the depths of the depression, not the end. We're at 1932, or we're in early 1933, whereas the depression lasted through 1937, according to even a relatively, milquetoast source like, say, Wikipedia. This is compared to a variety of other crashes and panics that happened before the era of central banking, before the era of massive government intervention in the market. And we can understand how government spending, specifically on the most shaky banks, the most shaky businesses, propped up things that should have been liquidated and kept them going longer, keeping them wasting actual resources. Remember, or, just for example, imagine there's a factory that is using oil to make rubber duckies, right? Well, if the price of oil goes above the point where people would pay as much oil as it takes to make a rubber ducky for a rubber ducky, then what's going to happen is that they're just going to keep using oil and keep accumulating unsellable rubber duckies, or at least unsellable for a profit rubber duckies, right? And so what we want to happen in that case is for the entrepreneur running the rubber ducky factory to say, oh, I need to stop making rubber duckies for now until either the price of rubber duckies increases and demand increases, or until the price of oil drops, because there's other people that are using that oil for more necessary things that are still profitable. That is the bottom line of Austrian business cycle theory, is that these malinvestments are created. Well, that's the bottom line of business cycle theory. The Austrian side of the business cycle theory is that government is that the thing that creates these bubbles, creates these booms and busts, is government spending specifically and government meddling in the interest rates. Because if you think that the interest rate is 5%, or rather, if the government is telling you the interest rate is 3%, and the interest rate is actually 5%, you're going to do things that go out longer than you otherwise would. Again, all this theory is covered in the first 3 chapters for the most part. There's a little bit of theory later on after that, but after that it's mostly history. All these videos are available in a nice happy playlist. I've got the website posts where hopefully you can get my show notes. And the one thing that I did that I think is really worth doing for a book like this is I went through and I basically bibliographied the whole thing. And I found modern links that are mostly functional for most of these sources. Now, unfortunately, as of this recording, the Internet Archive is in serious trouble and may end up collapsing under its own stupidity for, not handling, not handling government copyrighted material properly. We'll see how that goes. They've currently been hacked and are down, so a lot of those links that I provided are not going to work for the time being. Hopefully it all gets fixed up, or hopefully a competitor shows up and takes all these out of print, not being sold books that are often out of copyright as well, and puts them up somewhere. Because as of right now, the only people doing that, as far as I know, is the Internet Archive. Yeah. I mean, if you find links that are going to the Internet Archive and don't work, the thing that I found that works reasonably well is typing in the name of the author and the first 3 or 4 words of the title in quotation marks. You can usually find a Google Books link there that will at least, tell you whether someone's selling it at Amazon or something like that. And of course, a lot of this stuff is going to be stuff that you're only able to find in microfiche at university libraries this time. It's one of those things where the university, what do you call it? The university journal system kind of does this to people, where a lot of this knowledge gets put in places where it either decays and becomes lost, or it gets stuck in the third drawer from the bottom of some warehouse somewhere that no one knows about in microfiche. It's kind of sad to see that happen. There are examples of both. Like the old Barron's stuff, I just could not find it at all. I could not find, it on the Barron's website. I couldn't find links to it on the Barron's website. I don't know. Anyway, that's where we're at. We'll call it here. I'll be starting a new book soon. And thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And my stupid thing is, there we go. I hope this was helpful for you if you're going through this book. Definitely been a really good primer on Austrian business cycle theory, and a good historical examination of the situation around the real first Great Depression that was extended for nearly 10 years by government meddling in the markets. Anyway, that's all I've got. Thanks again. If you enjoy this and you're still here and you want to help the channel out, you know what to do. And aside from that, I'll say thanks again and see you later. Have a good one.